So, does this sound familiar? You've set up a fantastic beginning. You've introduced all of your characters, you've established the plot and the setting, and introduced us to all of your characters. But you're only about, maybe 10,000 words in, and there's supposed to be an entire novel's worth of story. Then you get a sinking feeling as you continue writing. Everything feels boring and disjointed from the main plot. So the writing is putting you to sleep and everything feels like filler in order to give the characters something to do until the climax. Or maybe you've got so many unresolved subplots going on that everything is just getting confusing and the story is going nowhere fast. Everyone is just meandering down different paths so far from the main plot that it feels like it's now impossible to wrangle all of these different thoughts. You may have even just forgotten some of these subplots altogether and they've just fallen off the face of the earth for good. Uh-oh, looks like you just made it to the middle. The muddled middle. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aaron Dusk, indie author of two books, The Mark of Emuli and The Varcross Key. If you're interested in reading more of what I write, or if you're interested in learning more about me as an author, I do have free rough drafts available on my website at theliteratebeast.com. You can also, there's also a lot to do there. There's about me, there's a store if you happen to be a fan of my work, or there's also a blog which I usually showcase all of these YouTube videos and sometimes write some stuff too. So also, if you want to support my work and this channel, check out my Patreon. And as always, liking and subscribing helps grow this channel as well. So as an author, I've experienced quite a lot over the course of my writing career, but nothing quite as deceptively daunting as the muddled middle, or the muddy middle, as some writers call it, the point where everyone gets bored and either gives up or works on other things. This is a very common issue, and it's actually one that I used to struggle with as well, until I figured out exactly what was happening and what I needed to do. For me, I used to struggle with too many subplots that didn't really go anywhere. For others, the middle might be just a bunch of uninteresting filler. So let's start. Tip number 1. Give the reader what they came for. Most of the juicy stuff starts to happen in Act 2 of the story. And this part is often referred to as the promise of the premise. What that means is this is the part where we've gotten the intro out of the way and established what we needed to establish in order to get to the part that was promised in the blurb on the book. I'll use Harry Potter as an example. The blurb tells us that on Harry's 11th birthday, his adventures in Hogwarts actually begin. That's the promise of the premise, okay? So that is what the readers got the book to read about. But sometimes a writer might get sidetracked by something else that takes them a bit off the rails. Let's say that J.K. Rowling had drawn out Harry's conflict with his aunt, uncle, and cousin. And let's say Hagrid came to the house, but somehow Harry couldn't leave unless he, cleaned the entire house or whatever. And his aunt and uncle kept trying to delay his departure, sending Harry on more and more ridiculous errands to run. This is usually how a muddled middle begins. You deviate away from the promise of the premise and start taking the character down these other subplots that have different conflicts than trying to keep the focus on the main plot of the story. Let's also use C.K. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The promise he made in the blurb was that the children would travel through a wardrobe and end up in this fantastic world where they would encounter a witch who tempts one of them to be her servant with Turkish delight. The most disgusting of all of the candies, and I don't know why. What would be about Turkish delight that would make anybody turn on their siblings? But anyways, that's part of that is the promise of the premise. So let's say if the kids spent the first half of the book in conflict outside of Narnia, let's say in conflict with the master of the house or with the maid or whatever, and then let's say that they go into into the wardrobe and they end up in Narnia, and then they just encounter all of these different conflicts between the different characters. I don't know, they meet the wolves at first, and they have a conflict with them. So we just keep getting all of these different conflicts instead of what was promised in the blurb, and this would lead to a muddled and unfocused middle. Keep in mind, when you start diverting down, a different path, ask yourself, where does this eventually lead? And will this align or lead up to the promise of the premise, the premise of the story? The premise is the main event, the story everyone came to see. Keep the beginnings, relatively short, and deliver on what you promised to the reader. This is the part in the story where you should be having fun, okay? The reader should be hanging off your every word at this point. I'll use my story, The Mark of Amuli, for example. The beginning was chapter 1, but the promise I made to the readers actually begins in chapter 2, when Amuli ends up on Alex's doorstep. Imagine if I had just, had the conflict more focused on the fighting between him and his parents, or just had him, had some sort of conflict happen between him and Liam when he first meets him, or maybe get to know Liam a little better and just have them faff about the forest for a little while before we even get to the point where he meets Amuli, before we even get to the that inciting incident that leads up to Act 2. That would lead to a very, unfocused and disjointed middle. It will actually send us down all of these different paths when we should be focusing on the main conflict of the story, the main plot of the story, or the main premise of the story. Tip number 2, remember, conflict drives the narrative. This is more of a tip for people who have trouble filling in the middle, more than like the people who have all of these different subplots that go off on their own little tangents. If a character is on a quest and he meets different people who join his party, but no real conflict happens to the character at the start of the journey to the climax, it's going to bore the reader. There's really nothing happening to drive the story forward. Now, when I say conflict, I don't mean putting your characters in a constant state of peril, and it just this series of unfortunate events that just never seems to end. Conflict can exist between maybe the main character and another person in the group, if we're talking about like a hero's journey fantasy, for example. Or maybe the conflict exists between two side characters and the main character has to step in to resolve said conflict. And the conflict doesn't even have to be anything serious or life-threatening. It could be that one of the characters falls asleep naked and drunk outside and gets arrested, and the party has to figure out, how to deal with this, or maybe a way to bribe the jailer to break their party mate free, or their party member free. You can work in conflict that has a bit of comedic timing or comic relief for the reader, so that it continues to entertain and it doesn't just become this series of just terrible events that the reader has to trudge through with absolutely no relief. So, for example, in my upcoming book, When Life Gives You Werewolves, Arthur is hit by life at all angles, while on top of having to deal with the other main character, Simon, who is just this really annoying homeless werewolf who follows him home one day and gets him into all kinds of trouble. Not all of the conflict is serious, and some of it is downright hilarious. So that actually breaks up the monotony of the seriousness, while also driving the narrative forward. Think of conflict as the character wants something, but something or someone stands in the character's way. Now, it's very easy to lose sight of the premise of the story, so always keep that in the back of your mind as you're creating more conflict for these, for the characters to make things interesting, to drive the narrative forward. Does this conflict get the main character closer to the end goal, which is the overarching plot of the story? So what I'm trying to say here is, if you keep throwing conflict at your characters, the story happens. We start to learn how these characters deal with these conflicts, which will play into how they deal with what happens in the darkest night portion of the story, which leads into the climax of the story. So now that you know that conflict drives the narrative, we cannot forget tip number 3, which is Give your readers reprieve. Conflict isn't everything, and if you have too much, it will throw off the balance of your pacing. So you want to give a bit of something that adds to the character development. These moments of downtime are often emotional conversations, maybe comic relief, romance, discussions of like plans of how you're going to, or how the character is going to proceed, and so on. If every beat of your story is some kind of conflict, then we never really get to establish who the characters are at a really fundamental level. And character development doesn't just happen in the beginning of the book. The characters should never be the same people by the end of the story, usually changed forever by the events or by the other characters. It doesn't matter if it's a light and fluffy romance or a gritty dark fantasy. We need to see the characters interacting with one another, learning, evolving their opinions that they may have had at the start that they no longer have anymore. We need to see what they are like when the stakes aren't high, as well as what they are like when they're at their most vulnerable. You only get this kind of character developments in scene where the conflict takes a back seat and gives the reader more time to breathe and really get to know these characters, how they interact with one another. This is what I mean by allowing the readers a reprieve. Give them a break. Don't constantly throw conflict at them as well. So with the conflict and the reprieve out of the way, let's get to the pacing, which is the meat of what I've been trying to explain with the first 3 tips. The beginning and the ending of a story are always going to be relatively short, but everything in between is Act 2. Here's the bell curve for a typical story. Everything from the inciting incident to the climactic confrontation is Act 2, which you'll find is pretty much 2/3 of the freaking book, okay? The middle of the book, while not as important as the beginning and the end as far as drawing the reader in or leaving them fulfilled, it will need to give them a reason to want to get to the end. If the story is paced so fast that the reader hasn't really had time to connect to the characters, or if it's so slow that the reader feels bored, then there's a pacing issue. Pacing is the mud in the muddled middle. This is where writers get stuck until they've learned how to balance the conflict with the reprieve and, the fast and the slow pacing. While the middle of the book is most of the book, just remember that it's split up into different sections as well, and each of those sections are paced a little differently. The beginning is going to be slower paced than the point where the inciting incident happens, which is going to be more moderately paced. While you start to have rising action, the pace speeds up. So once you get to the turning point of the story, that's when the pacing takes off, okay? So this is where the reader starts flipping through the book. They're completely invested. If you've written a good story up to this point, you've got the reader hooked, okay? They're going to be turning the pages. They're going to be wondering what's happening next. So this is where the pacing has to speed up to get us closer and closer to that conflict. Once you get to the conflict, this is where the pacing starts to slow down. So, that section between the falling action and the climax is where the pacing will start to drop to a moderate pace or maybe even slow down completely. And you're probably wondering, well, the climax is like the most important part of the story. Why is the pacing slowing down so much? You have to remember that slow pacing does not mean nothing is happening. Now, remember what I said about balancing slow and fast pacing. Well, slow and fast pacing doesn't necessarily mean conflict and reprieve. It can also mean the difference between telling and showing. So during the moments that are less impactful but are important to the story, you can speed the pacing up by telling more, by using more of the narrative voice. Telling the reader that the character went from point A to point B speeds up the pacing because nothing really interesting is happening between the 2 points. However, in the conflict, something is happening, something major is happening. So we've got to slow down that pacing and really describe what's happening here. This is the moment where swords are clashing against one another. You can smell the blood on the battlefield. You can feel an arrow pierce your character's shoulder, that sort of thing. The pacing is slowed down to draw out the moment more because everything in Act 2 has led to this moment. So we don't want to just rush past it. We want to slow the pacing down and really let this main conflict play out. And then once the climax is over, the pacing can begin to match the beginning. Slow while keeping the reader engaged enough that they want to know everything, has been resolved, to their liking after the conflict is over. And of course, we'll get into endings and how to make them satisfying in a next video. Tip number 5, and this one's going to sound very familiar. Keep presenting questions and answers to those questions. While conflict may drive the narrative, questions and answers actually keep the conflict relevant to the plot. If you want to write a book that keeps the readers turning those pages, keep getting them to ask questions that they want answers to. And of course, answer some of those questions and keep them asking more. If you've made an interesting world and amazing characters, the reader will want to know everything that they can about what you've created. They may want to know if this character's relationship is going to last. They may want to know why this secondary character is acting really shady after that last encounter with a group of bandits. Or they might want to know why the character's love interest is suddenly aloof after the main character and the love interest run into his ex at the movie theaters. If the conflict doesn't present an interesting question, or if everything is just answered or resolved too quickly, then that doesn't keep the readers reading. It makes the conflict feel like filler instead of a part of a story that actually matters. So this was a tip that I gave for beginnings, okay, and I'll actually link that video somewhere over here. And it really holds true, as I said, for the entire story, or the majority of the story, I should say. I'm going to give a little bonus tip here, and it has to do with telling versus showing. There are so many videos and blog posts out there giving advice that usually says you should show instead of tell. But they always neglect to include why that is. They often parrot this advice without giving the details on what each method of storytelling actually does to the pacing of the story. And they're also very wrong about this, because you want to both show and tell in a book. A book would be so slow and long if everything was shown, and the reader would be very disconnected from the story if everything was told. So when do you show and when do you tell? So as I stated above in the pacing tip, if something important is happening and needs more description, then show it. If something happens that gets the character to the next scene, then tell it. So for example, let's say that a character is driving from his house to work, but nothing of importance happens along the way. The conflict actually starts at the office. So in this case, you will tell the reader that the character has driven from his house to the office. So this way we can get to the important scene where something happens. But let's say that the character is driving from his house to work, but then he gets into a car accident, okay? You'll want to slow the pacing and show what is happening, because this is actually important. This is relevant to the plot. Once you start writing more, you'll start to know when to show and when to tell. If the pacing feels too sluggish in certain areas, but are relevant to the story, consider telling that scene, okay? If the pacing feels too fast at important moments, slow it down and draw the reader in and show the reader what's happening. So that's really all I have for today. If you found this video helpful, like and subscribe, leave a comment below, ring that, or press the notification bell for whenever I get these videos uploaded. I'm trying my best to get them, at least one video out a week, and I'm scrambling to get this video done before Tuesday, because it's just going to be a lot of shit happening this week. I've got 2 interviews lined up on top of having jury duty crammed in between them, because, when it rains. Anyways, I'll see you guys next video.